I'm Beverly Kirk. I direct the Smart Women, Smart Power initiative here at CSIS. And thank you so much for joining us for Perspectives, Women of Color in International Affairs. And I'd like to issue a special welcome to those of you watching online. This event is part of the CSIS Diversity in Leadership in International Affairs project, which is led by Talia DeBovie. And unfortunately, she couldn't join us today because she is recovering from surgery, but we hope that she is watching online this morning. The project works to elevate diverse voices and perspectives in international affairs. Now, before I introduce our panel, a few social media reminders, and I hope everybody's tweeting this live. Our accounts are @SmartWomen and @CSIS Diversity, and we are tweeting from both of those accounts this morning. If you are live tweeting, and again, I hope that you are, please throw in the hashtag CSIS Live. Now, if you happen to hear a fire alarm or something like that, I'll give you instructions. We'll exit the building and meet over by National Geographic to make sure we can do a head count. Joining me this morning are three incredibly accomplished women to talk about how our country fully benefits from including women of all backgrounds in foreign policy decision-making. And we're also going to talk about some of the challenges that women of all backgrounds face in making sure that they are included in the foreign policy and national security conversations. I'll start all the way to my left. Mika Oyang is Vice President of the National Security Program at Third Way, a public policy think tank, and name a national security issue, and she has worked on it. She had a long career on Capitol Hill, including serving as subcommittee staff director on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and as a professional staff member on the House Armed Services Committee. She is a lawyer by training, and if she looks familiar, it's because she's always on television. Next to her is Pam Campos Palma. She is a political strategist and a veteran. She served in the U.S. Air Force as an operations intelligence analyst, specializing in geopolitical strategic analysis, counterterrorism, and as an aircrew intelligence trainer. She served in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as Germany and Kyrgyzstan. In addition, she has worked as an international consultant for the United Nations, I should say, Population Fund in Southern and Eastern Africa, and with a poverty relief NGO in Honduras, and also as a strategy team lead in Guatemala for Global Social Ventures, and she began her political career in the immigrant rights movement. And next to her is Angela Bruce Rayburn, and Angela, let me get my notes back out here, is the Associate Director for Advocacy at Global Health Advocacy Incubator. It's a development agency providing strategic support to local advocates in low and middle income countries to enact and implement laws promoting public health. She previously was a senior policy advisor for Oxfam's humanitarian response in Haiti following the 2010 earthquake. She also worked on Capitol Hill, serving as a Congressional Black Caucus Fellow in the office of then CBC Chair, Congresswoman Carolyn Cheeks Kilpatrick. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
I'm going to throw the first question out there, and then whoever wants to jump in, and then we'll go from there. And also, be thinking of your questions. There are question cards on your seats, so if you have a question, please write it down, and Victoria, who's in the back, will come around and collect those, and we'll ask your questions of the panel as well. How well are women of color being fully included in the foreign policy conversation, and what are some of the challenges to making sure these women, we women, are heard?
Who's going to jump in first?
I'm happy to talk about that a little bit. I think one of the challenges is that women have been underrepresented in these conversations. And I think back to my time on Capitol Hill. I served as Senator Kennedy's defense policy advisor during the Iraq War. And as the Democratic caucus was gearing up to raise objections to the war and understand what was going on in the spring of 2003, they called a bunch of us into a meeting. It was all the Democratic senators and their staffs. And there were 6 women in the room out of maybe 75 people. And I was particularly proud because of the 6 women, 3 of us had gone to Wellesley, and the other 2 were Madeleine Albright and Hillary Clinton. But it was a very small group of women, which means that 2 of the women were principals briefing, but then the rest of the women and the rest of the people in the room, there were very few women, 4 out of the 70 or so other people in the room. And I find that that's still true. I get invited every now and then to join groups of national security people who are thinking about what we should have as our agenda for 2020. And inevitably, I am being asked late to join a group that is all men, and I would be the only woman in the group. So, there are many, many more women who have tremendous qualifications, who've served at very high levels of government, who are just as, and in many cases, more qualified than I am to be in those conversations, but they're not there. And these are groups that largely come together through self-selection and networks of people as they exist. And so you have to wonder, what does it mean for women to be part of the conversation if it's a group of people who come together because they naturally run into each other and naturally socialize? And those groups have largely been men.
Right. So I think from my perspective as the Black woman, that also is a sort of a intersectionality discussion from people like me. Because not only is the issue of gender first and foremost, but there's also the issue of race. And while race is probably one of the more uncomfortable discussions to have, simply because people seem more comfortable talking about gender, but whenever you interject race into the discussion, then it becomes a lot less comfortable. And for Black women in certain, women of color, but I could speak to the Black woman experience because of who I am, there is a sense that even in the development world, it's not a place where you find a lot of Black women, certainly not in leadership. And I think it's because of this fact that, in respect to what Mika said about how people get in the room when they sort of run into each other. When your circle represents a certain group of people, then what you find is that when your circle is not open to all kinds of people, you realize that you can pick out certain people for certain, when there's a job in a certain organization, there's a sort of a, let's call up someone that we know, someone that we've been in contact with, someone that we like, and that's the person that ends up getting in. And that means that there are certain people that are often excluded, and it's mostly women who are excluded, and certainly women of color. And in the development field, Black women are extremely underrepresented. And I think that the reason is because of the fact that circles are so small and that there's so much sort of behind the scenes maneuvering around some of the top jobs.
Before Pam jumps in, I was asked this question once about how do you make sure that you are being inclusive? And my answer is you have to make your social circle inclusive.
Right.
You have to get outside your comfort zone if it's not comfortable for you, but you have to get to know people who are different from you so that when the time comes and there is a position open or you're asked to recommend someone, you have a plethora of people from different backgrounds to say, hey, check out this person, check out this person, and it's not all the same.
Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, to answer the question is we're not doing well, right? So I grew up in a blue-collar Irish Catholic neighborhood outside of Boston. My mother is a Honduran immigrant. My father was from Guatemala. And I enlisted in the military right out of high school, not having many options for college. And my body, my mind can still feel the first time that I gave a briefing to a room full of commanders, right? I was maybe 20, and the room was easily heavily white, older men, high-ranking officers. And I think a lot about the conflation that we don't even really exist in these spaces because we are few, right? Even myself having a pretty prominent role, I was seen as someone who was fringe, someone who was not really part of the mainstream. Even though I was wearing the same uniform, I had gone to the same schools, I was there for the same mission. And so I think a lot about the conflations in the space that set us up for failure, right? Is there just aren't a lot of us here. Well, that's because we weren't really invited to the party, right? We weren't really made to feel that we were part of the team. And so I think about that a lot, and I think about the ways that we're set up for failure, and diversity and pluralism takes work. It might be inconvenient, but I think that we have not yet reckoned with the big returns that we will receive if we make our teams, particularly in the space where we need a breadth of intelligence and knowledge and wisdom and lenses to have an analysis that's grounded in reality. So I think about that a lot, is that, yes, we are sometimes few, particularly I think in defense and in security, But what are the ways that we're opening up the pipelines to say, this is where you belong, this is where you're needed to serve?
And how do you get people to understand the benefits? I know, Mika, you have stories, well, you all have stories because you've told them to me about situations you found yourself in where people didn't necessarily, what you were there to do and what the expectation of you was didn't match up. So how do you get people to understand all of the benefits that come along with having women from particular backgrounds in the room to help with decision making?
Yeah.
Mika, you want to start? Perhaps tell the story that
so, there's sort of a flip side to this. One is sort of the advantages of being a diverse person and not being what people expect in the national security space. And when I was on the intelligence committee, I was traveling and met someone who was in the intelligence services who was ethnically of the country where they were operating. And they would go into meetings, and even though they were a declared officer, the people that they were working with in the host nation would often forget that that person was an American and not one of them, and would just begin speaking openly about what they wanted the Americans to do, what their real concerns were, and this person was in the room and got to hear all of that. That was an advantage that someone who was a Caucasian white male would not have had in that room. So that was a tremendous advantage. But that comes from being diverse. But then on the flip side of that, people's assumptions that people who work in this field should look a certain way are going to be of a certain age, white male, wearing Brooks Brothers or one of like 3 different military uniforms. They make assumptions that that cause them to overlook people's participation. And this is something else that happened to me when I was on the Armed Services Committee. I was traveling with a member of Congress to Japan. And we met with the Navy commander there. And he spent the whole meeting talking to the member of Congress who was trying to pitch him on like additional home porting in the member's district, right? Which the guy didn't really want to talk about. We spent the whole time talking about that. The end of the meeting comes around. His aide says to him, "Sir, just so you know, Ms. Oyang is the lead Democratic staffer on the Military Personnel Subcommittee. She's the one who's going to deal with all of the legislation in the bill this year." And he says, "Oh my goodness. I thought you were the translator. I have so many things I need to talk to you about. We have pilot retention issues, and I need bonuses for people, and all these different things." And I said, "I'm sorry, but we're at the end of the meeting, and we have to catch a plane." I don't understand why he thought I was the translator, because this is a meeting between Americans in English, and like, you don't need a translator for this meeting. But like his assumption that a young Asian woman sitting in this meeting could have had no substantive role, even though he knew from his aide in advance of the meeting that the senior person handling military personnel issues was coming to the meeting, meant that he did not have the opportunity to raise very serious readiness and personnel concerns that were in his interest to the person who could do something about it, because he was captured by his own stereotypes of what that person should look like. Right. And that is detrimental to his operational interest. And so sometimes when people are captured by the idea that, like, look, somebody who's going to be of power looks a certain way, and they make assumptions when the person does not match that expectation, they either exclude that person or they wind up picking someone who fits a casting decision and not a competence decision. And that's really bad for overall operations.
Yeah, I think that that's an interesting question, to the extent that I remember when I worked in Haiti, that was one of the real obvious areas where we talk about some of the failures in development that we faced in Haiti. There are many people today, after 2010, after the earthquake, that would look at Haiti and say, we didn't do great, and it's true. And partly, I think it was because of this lack of representation of Haitian people in the problem-solving environment. When the U.S. had sent so many people there, the United Nations had a lot of people. There were so many foreign people in the country after the earthquake. And what happened oftentimes, and particularly with us previously at Oxfam, I remember going to a meeting once where the meeting was set up for a certain time. And when I got to the meeting, it seemed like we were early. And I was thinking, where's everybody else? And it turned out that the person who had set up the meeting, a woman from Britain, she said, I always put it an hour early because the Haitians are always late. And I remember thinking at the time, and I said to her, you know, that we could do a better job if a Haitian person were in charge of this meeting. Here are a couple things that they would know that would allow them to make a better decision rather than tricking people into thinking that the meeting is at a certain time. One, it was during the earthquake. It was after the earthquake. The roads were completely destroyed. Everyone who traveled in that country at that time knew that to get from point A to point B took a very long time. Our staff people, the people who they were talking about, were coming from cities that were outside of Port-au-Prince, where they had to take 3 and 4 methods of transportation to get to work. Meetings were at 9 o'clock in the morning. There were so many ways that we could have resolved an issue like that in a way that was respectful, dignified, given what we had just come through in the earthquake. We could have had the meetings in a different place that was not as convenient for people like me, but more convenient for people in the country. We could have had the meeting at a different time. We could have had some kind of understanding about the fact that the road was so badly damaged that it took a long time for people to get to work. But none of those things were a part of the decision-making process because people making the decision were not Haitian. They didn't have the understanding. They didn't have the empathy. They didn't have even the sort of wherewithal to recognize that we were coming from we were just coming out of a traumatic situation, the earthquake. And I think the lack of representation of people that look like the people in the countries that we work in hurts our cause every time. Because what it shows is that our inability to understand this or to understand the real issues at stake makes us make bad decisions. And I think that making a decision that trick people into getting them to a meeting because you think they're always late is bad for policy in the long run, you know? So that was just one of my experiences in Haiti.
Yeah. I was going to say, how do you get beyond that? How do you change the things that you and Mika have described? You're all incredibly successful at a high level. Talk to the people who need to hear how to make it better, how to hear the people who need to be heard,
right,
or to maybe change the way you look at a particular situation, to be cognizant, and to frankly make our foreign policy more accessible, more favorably received, and make the tax dollars that go into aid be better spent.
I mean, one of my most prominent experiences in the military or in the international space is this feeling that not only are we an imposition, but we're an imposter, and we're not meant to really be here, right? And that translates to being treated like a liability rather than an asset. A lot of the times, a lot of my experience in the military was very much, even though I was carrying critical information, a lot of my experience in the military was being forced to lead from up front, being forced to stand up operations, train even officers in intelligence. There was still this feeling that you're a threat to me by being here, right? Whether for me it was, well, you're a woman, so are you really supposed to be here? Also, your sexuality threatens me, right? There's also, I mean, we've had these conversations where the response to including women in the workplace is don't talk to them, right? And so and also I think beyond that is you come with your own agenda. You come with this woman or brown agenda that is going to distort what we're doing here, when really it is germane to the mission, right? To have this lens. And so I think that there's a fundamental question about seeing us as assets, seeing us as a holistic contribution to the bigger picture if we want to tackle the world's toughest problems. I had a situation, so in the military, I had a top secret clearance and I was being asked to go to an elevated status in intelligence, and I had a colonel call me on my cell phone. And at the time, I was a reservist, and I was also starting to immerse myself in politics, and I was doing immigrant rights work. And so my voicemail is bilingual. It's in English and it's in Spanish for clients and stakeholders that speak Spanish. And when I talked to him later, he was just I could hear his a different tone, Before, he was very warm. I can't wait for you to join our team. And when we talked, he ended our conversation with, you're probably going to have a really tough time with your clearance. And I said, why? And he said, well, I'm assuming you have a lot of foreign connections because of your Spanish voicemail. And I was like, really? Because Spanish is one of the most prevalent languages in our country. And what I find interesting is when I worked with European partners, I felt, even as a bilingual speaker, less than, because they were speaking 5, 6 languages. So, for me, what I left that conversation with is you're the dude that is managing this unit, right? And this is the kind of cultural competence you bring to this work. That's a liability, not me, right? So I think that changing the paradigm and looking at us as force multipliers is really important. And I think that the way we change it is by naming it, by stop trying to be, I think that we're conditioned to be very polite. I think that this sphere that we work in has a lot of niceties. And I think that in my experience, the military is one of the most hierarchical institutions. And it really gifted me the knowledge and the skills to pull a colonel aside and ask, like, what did you mean by that, sir or ma'am, right? What did you mean by that? When, there was another situation where somebody in my unit had started talking about the illegal aliens and the invasion of illegals. And I pulled this 04 aside and said, I really want to ask you what you mean by that. And I told him, my family is from Honduras. And it still was a germane and important conversation because it planted a seed that's inappropriate here, right? And so I think that we need to gain the skills to be unafraid of power and to be unafraid to name things and to have these hard conversations and interrupt these dynamics in the spaces that we work.
I would also say on this, I think one of the real challenges in American foreign policy making is that we do come with a monoculture about how we should think about things. And it's not just diversity as a value, but it's diversity for effectiveness. And a lot of times people will denigrate emotional values like humility and empathy. But when you look at the way the United States has managed the reconstruction, the post-conflict reconstruction in both Afghanistan and Iraq, we could have done with a lot more humility and empathy, in that we were not constructing policy solutions that met the needs of the affected populations because we did not ask them and include them. So we imposed solutions upon them based on what worked for an American monoculture and did not ask people, given your cultural context, given your cultural reality, how do we provide greater inclusiveness, legitimacy, decision-making structures that meet your needs? And when you look at the ways in which those cultures have very much struggled to build stability, when we knocked down the existing cultural, social, and legal structures when we came in and did not build ones that felt natural and inclusive to them, in many ways, having diversity at the table will lead you to a more inclusive, but most importantly, more effective solution. And when we Americans think that we can get a bunch of smart, Ivy League educated people in the room and come up with a thing by ourselves and then impose it on people, we are not asking the question, will this work from the perspective of the people who have to live it every day? And I think that's one of the real values of diversity that we are missing right now, is this question of effectiveness.
I definitely think that Mika's correct on that. One of the things that we, again, going back to the failures in Haiti, if anyone wants to challenge that, but we probably can't, if we wanted to be honest. There was so much work that got done in Haiti that had nothing to do with Haitian people. Where Haitian people, we would go to meetings where the meetings would be in English, and that's not the language of the country. Haitians speak Creole. Haitians do not really even speak French. Only about 15% of the population speaks French. So 100% of the population speaks Creole. You have a meeting about developing a camp. You have a meeting about creating a water solution. You have a meeting about water and sanitation, and it's all in English. And you wonder, where are the solutions going to come from if it's not coming from the people in the country? I often have this conversation with my development friends about what I call consent for aid. This idea that aid is not really consensual, right? Aid, people come to your country and they give you aid as though, did you invite them to give you aid? I mean, this idea that you come into my country, you bring me aid, and you bring me your aid. You bring me what you think I want. You don't ask me what I want. You don't know where the schools that I need built. You don't know where the hospital needs to be built. You assume that. So you come in, you build a school far away from where it needs to be. You build a hospital. You do what you want to do because you have smart, educated Ivy League people in the room coming up with all. I'm sorry, but you know I am the product of the HBCU, so I'm gonna go hard for that right now. But the idea that you have these smart people coming in, and I'm not against them being smart, but you can't be smart in my country without asking me what needs to be done. You meet these young interns who've been in the country for 2 weeks, and now they're writing policy? Now they're advising people? No, that cannot work. And as a Trinidadian citizen, I want to challenge people on that and say, you can't know more about Trinidad than me. You cannot. Even if you want to bring me aid, you come and you ask me and you share with the government, what is your intention? What is it that we need? And allow people in a country to share what is necessary for their development. And that's the way to go, instead of this idea that you bring smart people and you tell them to sit in a nice little conference room in a hotel that most people in the country can't even afford to go into, and you make up a policy for them. That's what we do in development.
And I take your point, but I want to push back a little bit because
Ivy Leagues, gonna push back.
Critics will say, if you're in a situation, particularly in a country that's had a natural disaster, the countries that are coming in, bringing the aid are like, we're here to help. We want to help. Why on earth are you making a big deal about the aid that we are bringing? We're providing.
Yes.
We're providing.
Yes, I heard that a lot in Haiti. And so here's the answer to that. Yes, but you know what? There are a lot of qualified people in country. Find them. That is your responsibility. You can't just say or assume that there are no qualified people. I belong to a group right now called Black Women in Development. It's a Facebook group that got started after the Me Too movement last March. And I can tell you right now, in that group, there's about 2,500 Black women across the world, in the United States, all over the world. And I'm talking master's degree having, 5 language speaking, PhD, expertise here, expertise there. And they talk often about struggling to be a part of that conversation. So I say organizations have a responsibility. If you're going to bring aid into a country, I'm not against aid, but I'm against the way that we bring aid in this kind of way that we know best. And you people over there in that country, we're going to tell you how it's done. I think organizations have a responsibility to look for the people in the country. And I know what people are going to say. It's a disaster, so we're doing it quickly. But at some level, that cannot be allowed to continue over the long haul. And that's what often happens. So I say find a responsibility.
We also wind up wasting a lot of money in our haste to bring aid quickly that doesn't meet the needs of the people. And if you read the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan's report, it is full of these incidents where the U.S. has provided aid in a hurry that was totally ineffective because we didn't actually have a conversation about what was needed, and especially on infrastructure, where we were showing up with turbines for generators that could not get up the roads to the places that they needed to go, where we were showing up with smart meters to put on grids that didn't exist, that sat in warehouses until after their warranties expired and then were useless. I mean, we wasted millions and millions of dollars without doing an assessment first of, hey, what do you need on the ground? What is realistic here? Where are you starting and how do you move up from there? It is that kind of short-sightedness of like, we can just replicate the world that we have here in the US in other places that leads to really ineffective solutions for the people that we were talking about. Further, we have this real problem in United States foreign policy making, which is that if you are seen as too close in your understanding of the target population, you are suspect. And this is a long and deep historical trend in the United States. You look back at the purges of the China experts in the State Department in the 1950s. You look at the ways in which people who have connections to other countries and understand that cultural context are viewed as suspect and have hard time getting security clearances. And they're often viewed as suspect inside of their own security organizations. And I think this is particularly prevalent in hard security institutions. We only want people who have a very clearly American, as stereotypically identified, point of view. And so you see tremendous numbers of Mormons, for example, going into the intelligence services because they are people who are well-traveled, but we don't have any question about whether or not they have foreign contacts, instead of people who may be second or third generation Americans whose country of origin are those other places, because we have such a hard time getting them through the clearance process. And we look upon them with such suspicion once they're in.
And how do you change that? How do you get people to listen, to hear? Is it a matter of getting more women such as yourselves in the power structure and in decision-making positions? Or how do you get people to see this as a problem? Because I'm guessing if you asked a lot of people, they would not necessarily view this as priority number one problem to be solved. Right. But what I hear you guys saying is that this should be, if not top priority, a high priority.
Yeah, I think, look, the challenge is that if you don't approach this with intentionality of saying we must get diverse voices at the table and we must shake up the way the room looks, the default with not being intentional about it is to continue the inequalities in the structures that we already have, which is to continue the same kind of thinking that we've always approached the world with. And look, maybe that worked after World War II, where the United States is the most powerful country in the world, could in fact impose its will on the rest of the world because no one could challenge us. But we are now at a point where we have serious global rivals, where the countries whose attention we are trying to get, who we need to help us with the foreign policy challenges that America faces, have choices about which countries they want to work with. And especially when we look to China, it's not a given that the United States will remain the most powerful country in the world. It is not a given that we will continue to sit at the head of the table. It is not a given that people think that the American way of life is the right thing to do. And unless we understand better what the Chinese in particular have on offer, but in other countries as well, there are other rising global powers, Brazil, India, unless we understand what their perspective is and what they are offering to people in their regions, we will not be able to compete. And so it is a security imperative for the competition and health of the United States in ways that I think people do not appreciate. We cannot go forward without those understandings and perspectives.
I mean, in hearing what you were saying, what comes up for me is, are we grounded in what power sharing looks like, right? Inequity and disparities are about power. And what I abhor the word minority because I think it creates a distortion that we are the few and that we are, again, on the margin, right? And we are not part of the hegemonic power. And so I think the way that we solve it is by getting real with that question and building relationships across lines of difference, lines of class, race, ideologies, right? I mean, it's exciting to me that this room, I was wondering who was going to show up to this event because you see these events and it's like, well, I'm a woman of color and I'm going to go. That's a given. We want spaces for us. I think that we are starved for this conversation, but this conversation and this dilemma affects all of us, right? It affects men, it affects people across different backgrounds and sectors, right? My success and my ability to thrive in this sector affects men, affects my male colleagues, men of color who I work with. And when you uplift the most marginalized, all of us win, right? Our sector wins. We can make better products. And so I think that we need to kind of stop seeing it as a deficit and a marginal conversation and say this is, when you said some people would see this as not critical, I would say that we are seeing in real time today that we as a sector in international affairs are not equipped to have a good analysis of the biggest threats of our time because we cannot tackle this question, right? So we have to prioritize it. We have to bring more people into this room that are maybe not the targets of this issue of power sharing, but maybe the agents that could, I want to see more men be very invested in why are the Black and brown women in my institution not rising in power, in leadership and authority, right? Because if she wins, I win, right?
I think, can I just say that to what you're saying, one of the things that Black women in development decided was that we decided we had to take the bull by the horns as well. Instead of waiting for organizations like CSIS and USIP and other organizations to take us in, maybe we need to make it happen ourselves. And one of the ways that Black Women in Development, the women who founded this organization, we're a closed Facebook group for now, but we will become something else in that we want to start creating a network for ourselves. Our networks are so poor and sort of fragile in that we're not a part of a network of people at CSIX, for example, so that when jobs become available, we're not the first people that you think about, and we're not in the pipeline. But Black Women in Development, we've decided that we are going to put ourselves into the pipeline by a group of women having access to educated women in the field with a lot of knowledge and how to get our names out there. And we think that we have to be responsible for that instead of having it be where we're sort of waiting to be let in. I don't want to be let in. I'm really well qualified. I speak the language. I'm going to get in. And I think that part of what we want to do is to force this conversation. But we also want to be able to be a part of organizations like, to know people in CSIS, for example, to know how your pipeline works, to get mentored by people so that we could go into the high level jobs here. And that's really where I think we're not at this time.
I want to ask about allies because, Pam, I think that's what we're kind of getting at. How do you develop allies? How do you present and have the hard questions, have the hard conversations in such a way that it does not turn off people who could be your allies, who could open that door and help you get in to where you want to be, into the power structure, the larger power structure?
Yeah. I think for me, my mantra is that I want to be respected. I don't care to be liked. And I have seen that with a lot of colleagues that has gone a very far way.
But can women of color do that?
Say again?
Can women of color do that?
I think we can.
I'm just asking the question that everybody in the audience was thinking.
I call it assertive diplomacy, right? I think that there was a time in my life where I felt extremely conscious about code switching all the time and feeling inauthentic. And what I realized is I have to bring my full self to the table, right? I think someone mentioned like race could be a controversial topic. I reject that. I want to step with authenticity into a conversation, knowing that, yes, there could be landmines there. But what I've realized is that there are particularly white men that have appreciated my candor that have then gone to bat for me. The other thing I would say is that I think that I see some brothers in the room that have really stepped up for me. And what I've noticed is that we are also starved for investment in each other. Right? And so for the men, the men in my world that have been some of the greatest allies have been Black and Latino men who have not seen me as a threat. And also what I've noticed is they are also starved for mentorship. I think there's a deficit where we are trying to mentor each other and we're also all burned out. We're also all trying and struggling. Even I've had senior level Black women that have tried to mentor me who are also struggling themselves. And so when are we going to have the assertive diplomacy to go to our white colleagues and say, you have the political, social resources and abundance to invest and sponsor me? And I think that being unapologetic, that we are worth that, is worth the risk and the courage to say, I belong here as well. Even though, yes, there are risks. We could be rejected, but that's life.
I think that's, so I think as a Black woman, I know that that's a minefield. And I think most Black women would agree with that, and especially in a field like development where we're so underrepresented. But I agree that the conversation needs to happen. But I think that when a Black woman fails in this kind of work, and I'm speaking, and I'm not trying to exclude other women of color, I just want to speak of my experience. Black women know that we have our idea of, if we fail, oh my God, all of us failed, right? We know that if we do something badly at work, you wonder about the other women that will not have an opportunity to come behind you. And I think that is part of the way that we're sometimes concerned about how we come off in the workplace. Black women worry about, am I too angry? We know we got to talk in a very quiet way. Because if we don't, we can be perceived as upset when we're not. So again, another sort of constricted way that we have to operate. We have to be aware that we can't make white women cry at work, right? We know that because we know that if there's an environment where you're in a struggle with another woman and she cries, her tears could be problematic for your work. I mean, I'm not saying anything that black women in the audience don't know, and other women of color, right? So let's just say that we have landmines that sometimes, for many of us, we cannot lose our jobs. So it's not, and I agree with you, but I know that there is that moment when you think, you have to balance. What are you gonna give up at this point in time? Is it worth going to? Is it the hill you want to die on?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And some of us, many of us, are not in the position to die on the hill. So we swallow some of the indignities that we face at work in this way. For me, it's talking loud. I am always conscious of the fact that I talk loud, and I always wonder if people see that as a sign of aggression. So how to bring that down, even though I'm just a loud talker. Right? Or my Caribbean accent, is it too strong? Do I sound too foreign when I'm on the phone? Do I try to sound like I'm not from the Caribbean? All of these things play a part in the decision that you make to take on someone in the establishment, and even reaching out for mentors, right? So I say, I agree, but I think that it's not a hill that some of us are willing to die on.
Mika, you had something.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, it's not, this is a field where getting along with people is a path to advancement, not just for women of color, not just for people of color, but just generally in the field, right? The fewer enemies you make in this field, the less chance someone's putting a hold on your nomination when it comes up, right? So everybody's trying to get along all the time. And look, I should acknowledge that as an Asian woman, I have as a person of color, it's a double-edged sword, right? I am not laden with a lot of negative stereotypes that other minorities have, and that is a benefit to me. At the same time, I have other stereotypes about my submissiveness or deference that other people assume, so that they are not going to look at me as somebody who is going to be a leader. So it's a little bit of a different challenge. I've had many male colleagues say to me, I've always thought of you as white, right? Like, I don't even know what I'm supposed to do with that, because it's both a denial of my ethnic and cultural heritage, and also like sort of but you're really one of us. It's really fraught. But I think that one of the real challenges for minorities in leadership roles, for us to sit at the head of the table, is that if you're a minority, as Angela says, like you take a risk and you fail, you're paying a price not just for yourself, but for others like you. And you're much more likely to incur a negative price for risk-taking and failure than you would if you were not a person of color, which means that your risk aversion is a lot higher. And in a world where leadership is rewarding innovation, entrepreneurship, risk-taking, right? You hear about this all the time in Silicon Valley, like people have to have a couple failures under their belts. Well,
Fail
if you
fast.
and right to actually succeed, as a minority, you don't have that margin for error. Yeah. So it means that you are more cautious, you are more careful, you don't reach as far in the big risk, big reward category, because failure could be fatal to your career. What that means is that there are fewer of us who have big successes out there that were bold, innovative ideas when people are looking for leaders. If we don't start thinking differently about what leadership is, that in fact sometimes those bold, risky things lead to massive enterprise-wide failures, right? Yes. Look at some of the financial crises that we've seen. Actually, gender-integrated teams did much better in those circumstances than all-male teams that were a little too risky and put their investors a little too much at risk. If we don't think differently about what leadership looks like in the management of risk, we can go too far ahead of, lean too far in one direction. And so a team that is led by and includes a wide variety of voices helps you hedge against groupthink that takes you in the wrong direction. And we have to think about leadership differently. So it is not just about boldness and innovation. It's also about preparation and understanding the market and understanding what success is and being careful in planning.
Empathy.
All of those, and in empathy.
Humility.
Right, and all of these things, they will help lead an organization to greater success than one that's going to say, let's just bet it all on the moon and maybe sometimes we're going to get lucky. it is a very different challenge, I think, for people of color to be included in the selection process for leaders of organizations if the people who are doing the selecting have such a narrow view of what leadership looks like that they cannot see the leadership potential in those of us who don't fit that mold in bringing our true selves to work. And I think that is a real challenge for all the people who are on hiring committees, in selection committees, in recruiting firms. People need to think more broadly about what makes a good leader.
And while we're talking about leadership, I just want to follow up. And again, if you have questions, please write them down. Victoria will be around to collect those questions, because I want to start taking your questions here with the panel. But let's talk about a little bit more about leadership and being in the power structure. How do you get noticed, given the things that you've outlined that are challenges sometimes for women of color? How do you get past it? Because I want this conversation to have takeaways for people who are watching and listening. How do you get past it? Because each of you have gotten past it. What did you do? How did you do it?
So I would just say, one of the things that I did early on in my career, and this was an advantage because I started on the Hill, is that when you're in meetings, it's important to ask questions, to clarify what the mission is, to increase your understanding. But as a person of color in the room, it can often feel very fraught when you ask that question, like everyone's judging me about whether or not that question is smart. One of the things that I had to do early on in my career, and I still do, is to think about myself not as myself, but as the representative for someone else, right? Whether that's a member of Congress, whether that's my organization, whether that's a group of people, and think, on behalf of this group of people, or on behalf of my organization, I need to understand this thing and clarify it so that we can succeed. And putting yourself in a representational role takes away some of the risk of personal judgment in the asking of questions, and then it allows you to think about it from a specific perspective of others. And it's that service to others that helps, I think, for me, get over some of that fear of like, oh my God, they're judging me, and what if I ask a dumb question? When you're working for members of Congress, you can say, look, this may seem like a dumb question, but I'm going to have to explain this to some members of Congress, and you know how they are. And then you just ask the question, and people are like, got it, it's fine. But like, it allows you to get over that, what may seem like the obvious dumb question in the room, but really needs to be asked.
Pam, Angela?
So I think what I found really interesting in the military is that the military is a place where everyone is supposed to be the same. You all wear the same uniform. Part of the process is that you go through a training that kind of strips you of your identity in a way so you can focus on the mission. But my experience was that I couldn't take my Latinaness off. I couldn't take being, a first generation American off. I couldn't take my brownness and womanhood off. And so I think a lot. Can you repeat the question? Sorry, I went down a rabbit hole.
Leadership and how you got past the barriers that may be unique to women of color.
Yeah. Early on, I realized that I was never going to fit into a box. I went into an institution that literally you're supposed to fit very neatly into a box. And even then, it was never going to really happen. And I think embracing myself as a unique individual, right? Mm-hmm. And seeing those things as assets, and also being very upfront with other people and unapologetic about those assets. For me, I think a lot about the minutes that are shaved off of my life, just being so tense and nervous about needing to be perfect in this space, being hypercriticalized, punished if you're not extremely strong, extremely competent. I know I'm extremely competent. I know that I'm an exceptional individual. But the pressure that we weigh on ourselves and that the world puts on us as well. So there needs to be a little bit of a release valve there. Not with everybody, right? But what I've found, and for me personally, is I am unafraid to tell people about my conditions, to entrust and be vulnerable and own that vulnerability and say, this is hard as well, right? And I've noticed that more people are willing to be part of my tribe, to be part of my army, and to also take care of me as well. But I think that it is unsustainable for us as women of color in this space to be everything for everybody. We're already being demanded, right? I've been people's mom, babysitter, housekeeper, their leader, their commander. We're asked to be so many different things that putting that and having other people hold that for us is not selfish. And we have to be discerning, of course, of who we do that with, but vulnerability is strength.
So I went the other direction. I thought that getting a ton of master's degrees was going to help me.
You have 3.
Yeah. And now I think back to myself, what was I thinking? Because you think that you want to get all this education, you want to be good at your language, you have to be best. You have to be all the time. I always say that women like me can't just be good, we have to be outstanding. We have to be great. We can't make mistakes. Because any mistakes that we make is going to be so big that we won't ever get to the leadership table. And I think that was perhaps, in retrospect, not the best approach. But at the time, I thought it was the best way to do it, to really buckle down and do all the schoolwork and get the language down and do it that way. But I realized, as Pam says, you can't continue doing that all the time. So I decided that I was going to just be me, and to speak my truth, and that's all I'm going to do. I'm not trying to go beyond that. But that took a while to get there. So now, when I talk to other women, certainly with the women and Black women in Dev, that's the advice that I give to young Black women who ask me, "How'd you get that job? What did you do?" I tell them that you got to just be you. Trust that you've done the best that you could have done. Trust that you've gotten the right education. Trust that your language is good enough, and go from there. And you don't have to do more, because I think it is bad for you in a personal sense. So that's how I live now.
First question from actually it's from Twitter. What advice do you have for individual non-women of color, specifically white women, to be supportive of addressing this problem?
I have an answer for that. Can I start?
Please, get it.
So one of the things that I have said to other women who've asked me that question is, be comfortable listening to what makes you uncomfortable. That's all you have to do. You have to know that sometimes the answers that you get will not make you happy. But recognize that this is, in development specifically, we have a very different, it's a different profession in that in development you're working with people at their most vulnerable. So how you come in and what's in your head, how you approach the work matters. So I say to white women who ask me this question all the time, be comfortable knowing that what you're about to hear may not make you feel the best. It may not give you, privilege and strength, but know that it's work that has to do with people who are the most vulnerable, and they need you to be humble. You are a guest in this country that we're talking about. It's not your country. You need to listen to what is being said. Open yourself up to being empathetic and humble, and you'll go a long way.
Are there specifics to the military or security worlds?
Yeah, I would just say, look, one of the things that anyone who is not a person of color who's looking to be an ally can do is listen carefully, pay attention to the way the conversation flows in a meeting. If a person of color makes a suggestion, reinforce that. That's a good point that so-and-so made. Or if they're not talking, say, I noticed that so-and-so hasn't said much. I'd like to hear what their reaction to this, so that you are inviting them into the conversation, right? The people who have more power need to invite into the conversation the people who have less power and hold up their conversations, right? It is something that many of us have experienced in this room, especially among women, where you make a suggestion in a room that goes unremarked upon until a white man says the exact same thing, and then everyone's like, that is such a great idea, we should do that. Yeah. And it's like, if you really want to be an ally, remember who the idea came from and say, yes, that was a great idea that Angela had, right? So that you redirect credit back to where it comes from. Anyone can do that, right? People of color can also do that, but it is important in terms of attribution and giving credit in meetings that we are accurate about that, and then we don't praise people who are appropriating other people's ideas, but recognizing the contributions that come from the people where it's organic.
Okay, another question from the audience, and I have a feeling this may resonate. Sometimes at my job, I get asked to do administrative work over my male colleagues. As a woman of color, how do I deal with these asks? Is there a way to respectfully say no?
I had this happen to me once when I was on the intelligence committee where a colleague of mine, we were both getting ready for briefers to come in, and he said, look, can you make the coffee because my briefing is here? And I looked at him and I said, my briefing is here and I don't know how to make coffee. And I walked out of the room. Look, I now know how to make coffee, but not in one of those big coffee machines, just in an individual thing. So like, don't ask me to make your coffee. I'm not gonna do it, or it's gonna be terrible and there are gonna be grounds in it. I think that they're one of those things where people have to recognize the value, and I think it's worth saying to people, it would be great if these tasks were distributed equitably among all of us. It seems like I am always doing them, and it's not that I'm unhappy to do them, because people want to contribute to a team, but that burden should be spread across a range of people. Oh, but I should tell one more story about that. I was at a dinner with some very senior generals of the Air Force and the Secretary of the Air Force, Secretary James, Deborah James, amazing woman. And we're having this long conversation about policy issues. And like all these people are pontificating on what the policy solution is. Secretary James pulled out a notebook and started taking notes. And at the end of the conversation said, so what I hear that we've discussed here are the following 3 things. And I was like, oh my God, you are the service secretary. You should not be the person taking the notes. But she was the woman who recognized that the administrative thing had to be done. But frankly, this should have been mafia rules. Junior guy at the table takes the notes and like reports back to the group, right? The 1 star at the table should have taken the notes. But it didn't even occur to him from a protocol perspective, that was his job. So the senior person in the room, because she was a woman, took on that burden. And that's actually a real challenge. Like, she could have said, hey, Roger, you take the notes for this meeting and make sure that you report back to us, because she was entitled to do that, but she took it on herself. So like, as a woman in power, it is also important to not let yourself take on that role because, oh, I should just do it because somebody has to, right? Assign the responsibility as well.
And Deborah Lee James has a new book coming out, I think, next month on leadership. So
she's amazing.
Yeah, she is very amazing.
I was going to say that one of the hardest lessons I've learned is that no one advocates for you better than you. And so it is only right for you to advocate for yourself. A lot of times I would find that I was very apologetic and very eager to try to prove myself, so I would take on all this work. I would set up the briefing, I would make sure that, I was doing all of the clearance, making sure that the phones, I was doing 10 jobs and thinking that that was going to prove my worth to others, when really I was devaluing myself, right? By saying I am okay doing everyone else's job, that I can't even do my own job well. And so I've become very clear in inviting other people to help me do my job best, right? A good leader organizes other, and saying, could you please help me with this? I need to do X, right? Do you want to help clean up because it's over and you all are just sitting around? I wouldn't say it in those words, but in my head I'm thinking that, right?
But also, your mother doesn't live here, works too.
But that's another thing that I found, is that they would, it's fascinating to me how these patterns repeat, but after, a training, a briefing, something is over, there would just be like a huddle of men just talking about stuff. And most of the women analysts were still like cleaning everything up and making sure, and saying out loud, like, hey, do you all want to help, right? Because this is a culture of service, so get in it. Right? And in my experience, there were some men that felt very uncomfortable, but in my experience, we are also resilient enough, and we have to build up the skill to be uncomfortable, right? Because we're already being put in an unjust situation. And when I let people know, like, do you want to help? They'd be like, oh yes, I'm so sorry, right? Mm-hmm. And so valuing ourselves is really the first step of advocating for oneself.
I think it's a funny thing that how people just fall into patterns. I think that you see it in offices all the time, where certain people who have certain type of job, like administrative jobs, they're the people who set up meetings or whatever. They're the people who will go and clean up the room. It's like an automatic. And we don't even notice how there are other people who could help who just don't, because, well, that's not what I do. It's kind of, I think it's a pattern. And I think, how do you break it? And I think that's what the person is asking. Because most of the people, and because the person who's asking that question is probably maybe in a different, in a role that she may not be able to say, to other people. And so, some of us, we're talking about it, but I think based on where we are in the organization, we may have a different response. I will say to her, to respond to that question, you got to find your allies in the organization that's going to be able to sort of support you when you start making those moves. Because if you don't, you could be left out to dry. Because at the end of the day, that's a practical question.
Right. All right, next question. How have you each dealt with situations where you are in a room largely made up of men and you are not taken seriously or are listening to them mansplain things to you, or you've been told you are too emotional? That's never happened to any of you, right?
No one would talk to me like that anyway.
We may have stumped the panel here.
So I have a tactic for dealing with this when people are mansplaining to me, which is known on Twitter as dragging, for those of you who are social media people. And this happened to me actually the other day. I was on Morning Joe. We were talking about North Korea, and I was on with Richard Haas and Admiral Stavridis, and we were talking about the sort of weaknesses in the Trump administration's negotiating strategy. And Richard Haas said something like, well, but you have to understand where the North Koreans are in their program and what's going on. And he was sort of denigrating my point. And I just said, yes, which is why we need to understand what's going to happen with the facility at Yongbyon and what the inspectors are going to do. I just came back at him with so much detail because I was like, don't pretend like I don't know what's going on. I'm going to come back at you with more detail than you came at me with because I'm going to demonstrate to you my competence. And at that point, Admiral Stavridis, who's a wonderful person, was like, yes, Mika makes a really great point. That was being an ally, right? But this happens on national television in front of all kinds of people. I had this happen to me with Governor Christie, where I was talking about witness congressional testimony and the administration witnesses constitutional duty to answer. And he said to me, oh, I love it when people throw around big words and they don't know what they mean. And I was like, constitutional duty is not that big a word, Governor. I'm sorry, but don't try and put me in a box on that because it makes you look like an asshole. And so I just come back at people with additional detail. I don't know how to handle that other than that. And it's not a great feeling to feel that way, but I get angry when people do that. And so you wouldn't like to see me when I'm angry.
Here's a multi-part question, so I'll ask just a couple of them because we've talked about risk and handling risk, but there's a follow-up question about risk tolerance and how do you determine what your risk tolerance is, and do you have 3 tips or what to do for advancement?
You got to be competent. Right?
Right.
At the end of the day, you have to be good, and you have to know the work that you're talking about. Because if you show any kind of weakness in that way, it's going to be difficult for you to advance. So I say competence first, and then everything else has to come behind that.
Mm-hmm. I think people really depreciate the importance of emotional intelligence and what that really means. For me, it means knowing yourself so you can assess and know others and the spaces that you're in, but being deeply conscious in who you are, how you react to different situations, where you need to grow some resilience or courage or just better assessment skills, but also be unafraid to ask questions about the people in the space. I make sure that I am very thorough and diligent in asking my community, have you worked here? Have you worked with this person? What was their response when you asked for X, right? But we also need to build stronger communal ties with each other because the space is small.
That's true.
Right? I've been fascinated at how many people are like, yep, don't go work with that person. They are the worst, right? And it's important for us to be candid and to help and uplift one another with this intel so that we can be empowered to go into rooms and know how to maneuver, right? So ask questions, but know yourself as well.
Yeah, that's true.
I would say there's sort of two issues on the risk tolerance. One is the sort of, do I speak out in the room, and how do I sort of navigate my own public appearances in a moment, or sort of semi-public appearances in a moment. That's something you have to sort of make a mental adjustment about what you're doing there. I tend to think that when you're doing public speaking, you want to think about what you're saying as a gift to the audience, so that it's less about like the audience is judging me, but I'm giving them information that will be helpful to them. So you're thinking more about your audience than yourself. But in in managing risk in programs and projects at work that are sort of a little bit longer burn, one of the things that we do in our office, which I think is really helpful, is we will often do exercises where we think through all the things that could go wrong and how do we prepare to address those things. And one of the things that you can do when you're doing that is bring in an ally to think that through with you, right? You're essentially murder boarding your idea, your project, whatever it is, like, what are signs of failure? And let's have that conversation, bring in a few allies into the room so that they help you have ownership of downside risk. And they can say, we've thought through these things, here's our plan for how we address them. But I think that is something that we often don't do enough in the foreign policy space. The Iraq War is an example of that. Like, we did not do enough murder boarding of, like, what if our assumptions are not right? What if it doesn't go the way that we plan? And that's a real challenge.
All right, this is a question specifically for Pam. Particularly with regards to foreign intervention, how does your background as an Indigenous woman inform your views?
It's a loaded question. I think that there's no better experience than a lived experience, right? Which is why, again, germane to this question, we're so important in this space. And I also think that a lived experience equips you with a nuance and a pragmatism while also being able to balance vision, right? So being an intelligence analyst, having served both in Iraq and Afghanistan, definitely gave me a lens while still understanding my own background, so I could hold really complex views. I think as a society and as a sector, we've really lost the ability to A, be wrong, or say, I need to redesign or reimagine this, or also hold multiple things at once, which frankly, communities of color, underrepresented communities have to do all the time. So for me, I think that it's really, I occupy this really interesting world where I often say I'm straddling borderlands, right? Because I understand historical context. I, have a really pragmatic understanding of border communities. I have a deep, affinity for human rights based on my own family history. And I've also been on the ground in different places and understand things in a different way. So, when I see these generals on TV kind of pontificating in ways that I think miss the mark, I feel a sense of duty to step up and say, actually, there's a different way of looking at this problem, which again, for me, is why we need more pluralistic and diverse voices and thinkers in this space, particularly communities that have understood what genocide looks like, what enslavement looks like, what the worst horrors of our world have really brought are the solutions for the future.
Yeah.
All right, a question for Angela. In the space of development, isn't the treatment of women overseas and in developed countries also stereotypical in their treatment of women in leadership, or are they more accepting and they embrace that?
Could you read that again?
Okay. Hopefully I didn't misread it. In the space of development, isn't the treatment of women overseas and in developed countries also stereotypical in their treatment of women in leadership?
Yes.
Easy answer.
Yes, because what in developed countries, we have, we are facing our Me Too movements, we're facing all of our own problems, and yet we go into these countries and we say to them, hire more women. When we look at in many of our own spaces, there's not a lot of women. So it's a little bit of, do as I say, not as I do in development. So absolutely, yes.
All right. This is another potentially loaded question, so keep that in mind as you think of your answers. Has the current political climate affected your experience? Do you see things getting better, i.e. more aware and inclusive, or worse, more divisive and defensive? And there is complete silence on the panel.
I definitely have a thought. I mean, for me personally, I think that crisis puts you into a more open mindset. Mm-hmm. I think that we are seeing a heightened state of crisis. And the question of what does national security actually mean, right? What is our foreign policy? What does these United States of America stand for and will tolerate or will not, right? And so for me, I've noticed people that before had a very whitewashed view of foreign policy, of national security, start to, I think because of their own fear of this moment, open up more to new ideas. But I've also seen the opposite happen. I've seen, my biggest concern is that people in the national security space are visibly seeing these threats, visibly are understanding, bigotry and hate as institutionalized policy and not moving, not becoming agile. And so that's the thing that scares me the most.
Yeah, I would say I have a similar experience where like there is a small but very vocal group of people who have unleashed some really awful sort of tropes about race and women. And as somebody who's in the media, I see a lot of that. Like I don't really appreciate when I go on TV and someone threatens to kill my mother. But at the same time, I would say within the national security community itself, the extreme nature of this administration has created a tremendous amount of consensus about what is really at the core of American national security policy. And that you see a group of people that might have argued really vehemently over how we do things agree that the things that we are arguing about are in our common interests. And so you see, right, you see this in the sort of movement of traditionally Republican foreign policy thinkers aligning with a lot of Democratic thinkers. That in some places the partisan divide has really disappeared, and there's a much greater acknowledgement of the need to be better on gender, on diversity, on empathy, on listening to our allies, on understanding those perspectives. And so my hope is that going forward, we'll hold on to this moment and not revert to the kinds of fighting that we saw before. Like, personally, I feel like some of the things that I've said, in the Bush administration, I did not appreciate as much as I perhaps should have, about the distinctions that he was trying to draw in Muslim communities, the distinctions between, those who were violent and those who are living a peaceful life. I think that we have a greater understanding of some of that language now. But at the same time, we have this really ugly, virulent strain of discourse in our country that feels emboldened to not care about what the rest of the world thinks and says some really ugly things to people that they don't know, to their neighbors, to people in the media, and that's a really uncomfortable feeling. And, we are experiencing that here today on this panel.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, we'll move on to, we have 3 additional questions, and they're all related from the audience. One, what steps can women of color take to get their foot in the door in male-dominated organizations? What advice do you have for women, and in particular women of color, who want to break into international relations? How do you break into networks? And then finally, how do we get more women of color in leadership positions? Should there be a form of affirmative action? That's a question from the audience. So they're all 3 kind of interconnected and related. Right. So who wants to jump into that first?
Oh, I definitely have some thoughts on that. We have affirmative action all the time, right? I mean, we have affirmative action when your parents are wealthy. We have, we have legacies to those Ivy League schools that we were talking about earlier. So I think that organizations need to create sort of these pipelines that can help to develop the women coming in the organization, and then sort of this mentorship opportunity to get them, to guide them through. When you get to the top job, it's usually because you have sort of like a shepherd, so to speak, someone to sort of advocate on your behalf, right? Someone who can speak about you.
A sponsor.
A sponsor. And to get into these organizations, and if you're in the organization, having those people on your side, those allies, I think that Pam talked about, you can get further in an organization. And if organizations don't make it intentional, where they understand that this is a part of how they will do better in the work that they do, then it's lost. For me, Black Women in Development, this organization, we have realized that there's such a gap in the network among Black women. The gap in that we don't have strong enough networks of people that we can hone our message, share our experiences, talk about what we're good at, our competence, how to advance us. We just don't have that in a very strong way, certainly not in the development field. And what I've gotten out of Black Women in Development in the last year has been a safe space to talk about how do we get to the next thing? How do we get on panels? How do we ensure that young Black women coming up behind us have opportunities for these internships that are hard to get, these internships that are unpaid, these internships that young women who can't afford to get in? How do we get the space to develop this so we can help them? And that's what Black Women Development is going to be about in the future, because we see how our lack of networking space, our inability to be sort of like in the circle has really hurt in development. And so that's one of the ways that it's going to happen. So
I'd like to call out an initiative by Ambassador Holgate, who's the former ambassador to the IAEA, which is actually really, I think, important, because I think it's very difficult for those of us who are diverse to be responsible for increasing diversity, like we're a small enough slice. These are things that have to be solved at the top. And Ambassador Holgate's got this initiative called Gender Champions in Nuclear Security, which is that the heads of international security organizations who work on nuclear issues make commitments to particular gender inclusivity pieces, and we could extend that to people of color, like you could broaden this initiative out. But it's really important, and they're self-selected initiatives, but there are things like the head of the organization will never speak on a manel, right? They will never speak on a manel. They'll commit that they will have a diverse pool of people in hiring. There are all kinds of different things that people can do. They can commit to unconscious bias training. There are all kinds of different things that people have made so that each of them are doing things that matter to their own organization, that sort of make sense, but they're all committed to solving this problem. And this helps address the structural challenges. And if funders in this space are looking for things to do, right, there are things that you can ask organizations to do. You can ask them to broaden their diversity of their boards. You can ask them to broaden the diversity of their leadership teams. You can ask them to broaden the diversity of their hiring practices. All of these things help create more opportunities for people of color, but we have to be intentional about how we do that. If you work for an organization that works on nuclear security and your organization has not, the head of your organization has not signed up to this, you should check it out on the website, and perhaps it's something that your organization would like to join.
Something I think about a lot is that we're in a moment. We're in a beautiful moment where we're seeing women really step into their power. And we're seeing historical moments of leadership, right? But I think that with that, as I hear people say, you know, women of color are leading the country and leading movements and making change, my question is often, and how are you investing in protecting us, right? How are you ensuring that we have real institutional power and are not being tokenized and co-opted? So I think that this has to be by design. We have to be I think that it is a service and a duty to be unapologetic that tokenism is racism and is exploitation. And I understand that, you know, a lot of folks say, well, we need to like kind of get what we get, but I think we are in a moment where we can demand more. So ask questions about what is your authority? What is your scope? What does your support look like, right? Because I think that as supply demand, diversity becomes more in demand, and there's, you know, we're trying to increase the supply, we should ask, how are you going to make this sustainable? Because the sector will demand everything from us, And it is important for us to also ask, well, what will we get to make sure that we are successful? So ask those key questions, and I think it's on institutions to make it by design. There's all sorts of arguments, but I do think that pragmatically, in the time frame that we're in, I don't think that wishing that more people will get interested in our sector from underrepresented communities is not a plan. So I'm really eager to see a lot of the think tanks, a lot of the foreign policy institutions create infrastructure mechanisms that make majority women, majority people of color, and also have invested money that goes towards that leadership. And the last thing I'll say is, as you're looking to immerse yourself in any space, be very careful of the stories you tell yourself. I think that we don't grasp that there is a hazard duty in this space of being gaslit, of being questioned all the time, the toll that it takes on our psyche, our mind, our body, of always having to prove ourselves. And it does not help when we tell ourselves, I'm also less than, I also can't make it, right? This isn't for me. So be very careful of the narratives that you fill in your own head. And I, no shame, have an affirmation space. On my laptop, I've saved messages from people who have told me, no, you're exactly what's right for this space. People who have sent me words of encouragement, and every now and then I'll look at it for my own mental health. Because sometimes it can be crazy making to think, am I in the wrong room, right? And it's good to have that community support around you that says, no, you're exactly where you belong.
Can I just add something to what Mika said? So I think, but in a practical sense, right, organizations know the diversity. I mean, how many articles are written every day about diversity and about how diversity is good for the country and that diversity is good? We hear this all the time, but yet you can get on any website of any organization, international development organization right now, and you could look at the web pages and you could see the leadership staff, and the leadership staff is 100% white or 100% male. That is true right now. So it tells me that inasmuch as we talk about diversity, because we talk about it in this sort of sanitized way, I call it in my mind, I say sanitized, meaning it's sort of this kind of whitewashed way. Because we don't really say, what is it that makes an organization have an Africa program where not one African is present? What is it? Why is it this idea that only certain people know about Africa? Or why is it that you look at Latin America and the Caribbean and you see not one person from Latin America or one person from the Caribbean? And it says to me that at the end of the day, when we even talk about diversity as being this great thing, in organizations, that's not really what people truly believe, certainly not at the leadership level. And I think that, or maybe they just like to use these kind of platitudes. Yeah, we like diversity, and then they'll find just one person somewhere and put that person in the job. And I think we have to address the fact that it is really not being done in a very impactful way. So, I mean, I could tell you, just go look at any one of these organizations, and you'll see that that's true. So that's my thinking, that it has to be intentional. It can't just be, because it sounds good.
Well, that is a perfect place to end. I want to thank our panel, Mika Oyang, Pam Campos Palma, and Angela
Bruce Rayburn.
Bruce Rayburn. I was about to say Angela Rayburn, but I know there's another name. Sorry about that.
That's fine.
Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.